All right, part 3. Write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of each conditional statement and circle if it is true or false. If false, give a counter example. Okay, so if two angles are complementary, then their sum is 90 degrees. And by the way, the statement that's given to you, this is our conditional. And remember, a conditional is in the form if P, then Q. Okay, so again, if two angles are complementary, then their sum is 90 degrees. This is true by definition, and we can take a look at our pink sheet. So it should be right here. If two angles sum up to 90 degrees, then they are complementary angles. But this is a definition. It's a biconditional, so it can go the other way. If two angles are complementary, then their sum is 90 degrees. Okay, we're dealing with these two angles here, and these two angles add up to 90 degrees, so it works in both directions. Okay, so that's true. The converse, remember, it's these two switch, so it's if Q, then P. Okay, so I would say if the sum of two angles is 90 degrees, then the angles are complementary. Right? So if the sum of two angles is 90 degrees, then the angles are complementary. So that, again, is true because even if I swap the position, this is still a definition. It's a biconditional, and it's true, 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 right? So it's true. Now I'm going to go ahead and write the inverse of that statement. So it's not P, not Q. If two angles are not complementary, okay, then their sum is not 90. Okay, so what I did was, remember the conditional is in the form if P, then Q. If you're talking about the inverse, it's not P, then not Q. And this is the squiggly line. It doesn't really, it's not an N. That's what I'm trying to say. Like, it's not an N, right? It's a squiggly line. It's a tilde sign like on your keyboard. And what it does is just negating the hypothesis and also the conclusion. So what I'm trying to do is say, what is the opposite of saying if two angles are complementary? I would say if two angles are not complementary, to negate it, right? And then what is the opposite of saying then their sum is 90 degrees? Then I would say then their sum is not 90 degrees, right? I'm just, again, the negation is making the statement, or, it makes the hypothesis the opposite, and it makes the conclusion the opposite. That's what the negation is. So, again, if two angles are not complementary, then their sum is not 90 degrees. So, if two angles are not complementary, then obviously their sum is not 90 degrees. So, that is true. Okay? And look at this. Because it's a definition, this is true, this is true, this is true. It's not always two true, two false. It can all be true. And since the inverse is true, then the converse has to be true. And if the conditional is true, the contrapositive has to be true. But let me go ahead and verify this. So the contrapositive is essentially not Q, then not P, right? So I would say if two angles sum is not 90 degrees, then the angles are not complementary. Okay, so if two angles sum is not 90 degrees, then obviously the angles are not complementary, so that is also true. Okay, again, by definition. So which statements are related? So it's the conditional and the converse. And then, the conditional and the contrapositive are related, and then the converse and the inverse are related. Okay? So if the conditional is true, then the contrapositive is true. If the conditional is false, then the contrapositive is false. If the converse is true, the inverse is true. If the converse is false, then the inverse is false, and vice versa. For instance, if I say the inverse is false, then the converse is false, right? So that's how it works. So all of these are true. Let's go ahead and do the other part. Number 12, if two angles are vertical, then they are congruent. Okay, here we go. Let me draw vertical angle. So if two angles are vertical, which I can assume true, because yes, vertical angles are always congruent. So this angle and this angle are congruent because of vertical angle. So that's true, they are congruent. So I don't really need to provide a counterexample. And again, this is my conditional. That's my given statement. To write the converse, I would say if Q then P, I would say if two angles are congruent, then they are vertical angles. If two angles are congruent, then they are vertical angles. So if two angles are congruent, are they vertical angles? No. And a counterexample would be this. So if I have two angles that are congruent that are not vertical, it would look something like this. Okay? So we can see that this angle here is 45 and this angle here is 45. They are congruent, but they are not vertical. And remember, vertical angles look like this. So that's false. Inverse. That would be not P, not Q. So if two angles are not vertical, then they are not congruent. Okay, so if two angles are not vertical, then they are not congruent. It's saying that if you are two angles but not vertical, does it mean that you're not congruent? Well, here I have these two angles. I'm using the previous counterexample. Look, I have these two angles that are not vertical. Yes? Does it mean that they are not congruent? Well, they are. These are congruent, so this has to be false. Okay? So you can see that, remember, with the related statements, the converse and the inverse pair up nicely. So if the converse is false, the inverse has to be false. Now, if the conditional is true, then the contrapositive has to be true. Okay. So contrapositive, by the way, is not Q, not P. So if two angles are not congruent, then they are not vertical. That's true. If two angles are not congruent, then they are not vertical. And remember, vertical angles are always congruent. So if you're saying if two angles are not congruent, then obviously they are not vertical. So, yeah, that is true. Okay, so this, these two things have to be related. Okay?